My name is Carroll Stewart, also known as Cal. 93rd Bomb Group, overseas as a radio operator with 35 spares after the air echelon had already left. And so I wearied of guarding airplanes in the night and dusted off a typewriter, being a Nebraska newspaperman, and I gravitated into public relations.
How did you happen to join the service, and when did you join?
Well, the heat was on, of course, and I thought the war was capable of going on forever.
Tell us about your trip overseas and what it was like when you arrived in England.
Well, the trip was, the sailing was in the last of August on the Queen Elizabeth, and as I understood it, we had 18,000 people aboard that thing, and the Queen was on her own, and she crossed in the, with a lot of zigzags and one grand circle, she crossed in the rough equivalent of what she did as a passenger vessel, which is some doing. And of course, when we got to Scotland, the Germans were particularly interested in the Queen Elizabeth and her cargo. And it's interesting, the Queen, it was her second voyage as a troop ship. And visualize this, she would leave New York with water, fuel, food. She'd go to Scotland, Greenock, and discharge the Americans and Canadian military people aboard, take on only fresh water. Then she would circle down around the Cape of Africa and come back up in the Indian Ocean and discharge British and other troops that she'd taken on in England, and then would discharge in the Indian Ocean and take on German and Italian prisoners. Then she'd come back into the South Atlantic and off of Rio finally would refuel.
How did you find out all about this?
Well, it would be logical for a Nebraska newspaper man to consult somebody who knew. And I did that, and the Queen had a small, miniature daily newspaper that was published, and of course I gravitated to the newspaper shop, the print shop. It was one night, the last night off of Scotland, she was so violently shaking and vibrating and rolling people out of their bunks that were stacked about 4 or 5 high in the hold of the ship. And so it was determined that later after the war I went to the ministry, and they conceded she was out running the subs that night. And that particular month of August, she didn't land until September, but the month of August the Allies lost 2 million metric tons of shipping in the Atlantic.
What do you recall about the physical conditions aboard the ship as you were going over on the Queen Elizabeth?
Well, the luxury features were gone, but the dining rooms were GI style, of course, and hot and humid, and but they had it arranged. It worked. They got everybody over there safely. And then when she discharged in Greenock, it took dozens of special trains to move the Queen's cargo out of there, and so the trains would stop in the middle of the night and when German aircraft were over, but the British had the defenses well organized, and Greenock was the western extreme that the German continental-based bombers could reach. So they didn't have much time to, much endurance over the content. If they found her, fine. If they didn't, but they didn't find her. Everything was eventful, and down they went, these special trains all over the countryside.
When you arrived at your base in England, what was it like getting ready for your first mission?
Well, the 93rd's first base was Alconbury, and it was on the Great North Road. Incidentally, the Great North Road went right through the middle of the airport. The housing was on one side of the road, and the operational side was on the other, north of Huntington, between in Hunts, between Huntington and Peterborough, and there weren't enough facilities, so our people, and particularly you can guess the 35 spare radio operators, all lived in tents. And ultimately, the engineers got some huts built, and when they got done building huts, the engineers were the only people still in tents.
What do you remember about your first mission?
You mean the 93rd? I did not fly. The 93rd, I remember it very well. A lot of stress. It was the 93rd had been in the theater a month. The first mission was October 9th, and the air echelon arrived on September 5th and 6th. So there were 4 weeks dedicated to preparing for it, and part of it was weather. They'd have gotten into action earlier, except for weather. The first target was Lille, almost on the Belgian-French border, and over 115 bombers, forts, and liberators made that mission with some limited escort, mostly Spitfires, but some P-38s. That was the first B-24 strike in the 8th Air Force. And the forts outnumbered the liberators that day roughly 4-to-1, and that was roughly the ratio 4-to-1, 5-to-1, 3-to-1, until late phases of the war when the liberators were on a 2-to-1 basis. And incidentally, in Italy, the ratio was reversed. For the 15th Air Force, the liberators were 2-to-1 in relation to the fortresses.
As you were on the base, what did you remember about the 93rd as your tour progressed? What was some of the key memories that you had about the 93rd?
Well, be assured the 93rd, in terms of quality, and there will be people who will want to challenge this, but in terms of quality, the 93rd had positively the greatest group of men ever assembled. And they had a comradeship that was unrivaled. Some poor tail gunner coming along was nervous about his first mission. Well, another experienced tail gunner would go visit with him and calm his nerves and soothe him, and then they would back up each other. And you must remember that early in the war, the personalities were so vivid. The inundation of people came later, but in that early going, the individuals just stood out starkly, and their qualities shone, and missions were few and far between, and it was all the shakedown. And the 93rd was on the cutting edge of every aspect of the air war in Europe. And in many instances were the first this, first that, first the other, which is a whole log that I could recite, but we won't take time for that. Next question.
Of the next remembrance that you have about the 93rd, if you were to pick out some single mission that stands out in your mind beside that first one, which one would it be, and what do you remember about it?
Well, it would have to be Ploesti, the great low-level battle at August 1st over Romanian oil refineries. And you must remember the 93rd, on 3 occasions, went to North Africa, once to North Africa, twice to the Middle East, for special missions. And there again, the B-24 had the range and could deliver the B-24 got the nod over the B-17s because of range and bomb carrying capacity. And there's a joke among the Liberator people that the Fortresses were medium bombers. In any event, 3 specialized trips, and then back every time to England to resume the air war over Northwest Europe. And then if you can visualize, Ted's traveling circus is what we called it. And if you can visualize a map, and starting at the north, the Ted's traveling circus, the 93rd Bomb Group, bombed Norway several times, not Sweden or Finland, of course, but Poland, and then Czechoslovakia, and then Austria. Coming around the other way, they bombed and operated out of Morocco, Tunis, bombed all those ports that Rommel was using in North Africa. And then they went up and, on a special assignment, softened up Sicily and Italy for the invasion there. And then the 93rd planes were over, oh, it's amazing, Corfu, Malta, Sicily, of course, Italy, Austria, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Albania, Romania. No other bomb group or military group in history can challenge that sort of a record and color. These guys would come back with money in their pockets from a half dozen realms. And so much for that. Next question.
What period of time are you talking about, and what was the survival rate of the 93rd?
The trips to Africa had to do with 1943, although the first one left England in 42. And then in January and February, and then they returned to England, and then they hadn't been in England but several months, and then it was back to the desert again to prepare for the taking out Hitler's gas station at Ploesti. In the meantime, Eisenhower had an idea that the B-24s, notably from England, should be used to soften up Sicily and the aerodromes and harbors and ammunition stores and so on in Sicily and Italy, and that ranged all the way from the Boot all the way up to northern Italy. And then after the famous low-level mission, which was very bloody and very costly, but it was pulled off by some very, very brave men. Bunker Hill and Chateau Thierry and Gettysburg, these guys are right up there at the top or ahead of it. They were positions on the airplanes on that low-level mission were sold for money. That I'll pay you $100, $200 if you let me fly. But that was going to shorten the war. Oh, they were fearless. And no fighter escort. There wasn't a fighter within 1,200, a friendly fighter within 1,200 miles. Think of that in those days. Now, we're talking about 1943. Now, today, that kind of range, 2,400-mile round trip, is accepted. But in those days, it was a tight squeeze to get enough fuel aboard and get up there and get back.
As you observed what was going on at that time, what were your most vivid memories about the Ploesti raid?
Oh, the heroism. You must understand that the attack was at 0 level. And the planning for that low-level mission came from on high. It came from Washington, and really came out of the Casablanca Conference when Churchill and Roosevelt met, and the overwhelming priority was they had to get the armies were moving, and Panzers and Stukas were all moving on lubricants and fuel, and so the thing to do would be to take out the prime producer, which was the Ploesti refineries, not the oil fields themselves, which were in the mountains, but the refineries, and even the farms, tank farms, were of no consequence, no of interest to our force. They wanted the cracking plant, the power control room of Romana, which is the biggest refinery in Europe, and they wanted the critical ports. And so these airplanes went in at 0 level. Sometimes they'd lift up and to clear smokestacks, and went through Inferno, and it was the most highly decorated military operation in history. 5 Medals of Honor, uncounted silver stars. Everybody got a Distinguished Flying Cross. 400 and some people killed in 20 minutes. Then from Italy, later, months later, they began to attack Ploesti from high level, and it took 23 missions. And when you analyze the tonnage and the sorties, a sortie is one airplane making one mission. That's a sortie. When you analyze the sorties at high level and fighter support that they had, then the low-level mission, except that some things went wrong, but the virtues of the low-level attack, the plan, in general, the outcome was the most efficient, and one of the most efficient missions of the war, although at the time it seemed like a horrible screw-up and very, very costly. What happened was, I don't know what's going to happen to this film, but in the round, there were 3 groups from England joining with 2 groups from the desert, the 376th and 98th. So in effect, England, the 8th Air Force, was furnishing 3/5 of the force. However, the 8th Air Force lent some planes to desert forces, and the 376th, 3 out of their 4 squadrons, only 1 squadron really factored. The others went around. So most of the damage, 3/4 of the damage was done by 8th Air Force planes, and the screw-ups, 90% of the screw-ups were by the desert planes. That's harsh, but that's the fact.
The aftermath of the Ploesti raid is something people would be interested in from the standpoint of the emotional impact on the people that were around the base. What do you remember about that?
Oh my. Then Colonel Smart was Hap Arnold's special guy, and he's the guy who designed the thing, the mission, and he brought it over to Colonel Timberlake, soon to be the general, incidentally. When Timberlake became general, he was the youngest general officer since the Civil War. Colonel Smart, Jacob Smart, had to sell the program to the commanders. And the first one he sold it to was Timberlake, because he was a wing commander. And so after the mission, Smart was grounded. He told everybody he was going to be flying it, and that was all fine, except somebody in Washington decided, no, you're not going to fly it. And the reason was valid, because Smart knew the progress of the Manhattan Project, which led to fission and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he would have been subjected to some untold torture if the Germans had gotten hold of him. However, later in the war, he was shot down, and they had him for 6 months and didn't know who they had. But that's a different story. Smart came back to England and to the 3 bases that had sent people to the desert for that mission, reported to each one, and he was responsive to questions, and reported information that was available to him up until that time. And so that low-level mission stood as the deepest penetration of the war until then, and it was costly. 52 bombers did not get back. However, some of them cripples made Turkey, Cyprus, down in Sicily, even one landed in Malta, others in Yugoslavia, and of course many shot down in the target area.
What was your own daily routine on the base?
What was I doing?
Yeah, what was your day?
Oh, I was in London, sleeping between the sheets, working on a book called Target Germany. And it was a Simon & Schuster publication, and that's another long story. General Aker was running the 8th Air Force, and so 4 people from his command collaborated on the book. And one was Major Richard Thruelson, who had been the associate editor of the Saturday Evening Post, and then Captain Arthur Gordon, who had been the editor of Good Housekeeping, and then there was a Lieutenant Cody, who was the facilitator, and then I was the color man. I was the only guy from a bomber group, and these other guys were. Anyhow, we were working on Target Germany, which appeared then in both England and the United States in December.
What else did you do during your combat tour in England?
Well, General Timberlake said to me one day, I was a buck sergeant and working my tail off, and he said to me one day, would your work be easier if you were an officer? And I said, yes, sir. And he caused me to be commissioned. Then he said to me one day, would you like to be my aide? And I said, yes, sir, but I've got some unfinished business. I'd really like to tidy some things up with the 93rd Bomb Group before I leave. And he said, let me know when you're ready. And so one day I was ready, and I rang him up, and the darndest thing, the special orders were cut the next day, and paragraph 1 made James Stewart, a lieutenant colonel then, chief of staff at 2nd Wing, and paragraph 2 made me the aide-de-camp at 2nd. So here are these two Stewarts in the same special orders, and purely coincidental. But it caused a stir because Timberlake got calls, what are you doing, bringing in a movie star and then bringing in a publicist at the same time? Well, they didn't know that my invitation had gone back some time, and James Stewart had a fantastic war record, and from what I observed of him when he was at the at 2 different wing headquarters, he never made a mistake in the air.
As you ended your combat tour, what did you do?
If I haven't made it clear, I want to do that. I never fired a shot in anger. I was not combat crew. I answered the telephone and ran a typewriter.
But you were in the European Theater of Operations in the combat zone, and that's why I used the word combat tour.
I was going to say, because that doesn't fit me. You know, I just been in Nebraska running a newspaper for all the good I did. I did, and then we'll terminate this. After that Leo mission, I was so overwhelmed with what was going on, and they had me guarding an airplane in the middle of the night, and that was kind of a waste of time. And so I went up to Peterborough and made arrangements with the publisher of a provincial newspaper to put out a newspaper and use their facilities. So I called it the Liberator, and I produced a paper with the brass wouldn't touch me because it was not authorized. But I put out the Liberator, and the boys really went for the Liberator, and it was a 2-page tabloid. And I did everything at the plant except run the big 30-ton press. They wouldn't let me touch it. And but the linotype and the layout and all that, I did it all. And I had a Jeep for the purpose, but the intelligence section wouldn't touch it. The base sensors were in London, and I wasn't about to haul it to London to go through the base sensors. Anyhow, the intelligence people on base let it all go home, and the boys really shipped them home. And then a few months later, they started up Yank and Stars and Stripes, and the British Ministry of Supply said to the publisher or the printer up in Peterborough, no more paper for this character. So they shut me off of print, and that ended my liberty. But it was the first combat newspaper. You used the word combat zone. So it was the first U.S., or probably in military history, combat zone newspaper published for the troops in a small unit. Then when Yank and Stars and Stripes came in, that was a little different story, but that was for everybody, all branches, Navy, Marines, Army, Air, the whole bit. But mine was the Liberator.
What do you want the world and history to remember about your contribution to the war effort?
Well, they can forget my contribution, but not that of the 93rd Bomb Group. I don't know. I go through those casualties, and I see ghosts, and I just think they're the greatest men that ever lived. And then you wonder how futile this may or may not have been. Certainly it was a change in the world, and of course it'll never happen again. There'll never be armadas of bombers going out as they did in 42, 43, 44, and early 45. But be assured, the 93rd Bomb Group is positively the most colorful military organization history has ever known. And you're welcome. Thank you.